Welcome to Stone Cottage Adventures. We all love a good story, and the story of our garden is a mystery. Or should I say, several mysteries rolled into one. Not scary Halloween mysteries, but good mysteries with satisfying endings. The most impressive features in the garden are the massive trees towering over the house. This first mystery is like a magic school bus mystery. The children find a big tree that's 13 feet around. That's 156 inches, and they wonder how old the tree is. One of the kids suggests cutting down the tree and counting the rings. Miss Frizzle says, "There's another way we can figure out the age of a tree." The magic school bus then travels back in time to see the acorns sprouting and growing. Miss Frizzle tells them they need to find the diameter of the tree. The math nerd kid says, "All you have to do is divide the circumference by pi, 3.14, and that will give you the diameter." Then Miss Frizzle says, "That's right, and then multiply that number by the growth factor, which is 5 for white oaks. The growth factor is very specific for each tree. White oak is different than red oak." The nerdy kid is calculating and calls out, 248. "Oh, the number you have just calculated is the approximate age of the tree. Imagine this tree was here during the Revolutionary War." At that point, the kids hear musket fire, and the bus whisks them back to the present. First mystery solved. So the oaks that shade the house in summer are approximately 250, 150, and 100 years old, obviously here when the house was built. There's also a large hackberry tree in the back corner that I suspect is about 100 years old. Never heard of a hackberry? There's a reason. But I do think the trunk is cool looking. If you're interested in calculating the age of a tree, we've included in this description below a link to a website that gives growth factors for common trees. Let me know how old your trees are in the comments. Growing in the yard are also an amazing assortment of plants buried under wild growth. Many of you may have experienced this same type of mystery. This is more of a Sherlock Holmes mystery with patient observation and scientific deduction. With an unfamiliar garden, you spend the first year just observing what comes up, because a well-planned perennial garden reveals itself over the course of an entire growing season. Lucky for me, the women in my family all love to garden, so I grew up hearing the names and learning the terms. I have inherited books and added to that collection for years. When I moved to Virginia, I would snag free local gardening books at the public library, even if they were dated looking. Immediately, I began to identify as many of the plants in the garden as possible. So how do you identify plants? Elementary, my dear Watson. If it's a common plant, you ask a neighbor who gardens or try a local nursery. When I did not recognize a plant and couldn't find it in a book, I would go online and describe it. I start with the most general information. It's easy to tell if a plant is a flowering tree or a woody shrub. Perennials, wildflowers, and bulbs die back completely in the winter. I then describe the flower, number of petals, color, size. Usually by then, the internet will give you some choices. If you've already made some notes on the leaves, it will save you a trip back outside. Are the leaves parallel, like a grass? Pinnate, like a feather? Or palmate, like your palm? Then note how the leaves present on the stem or branch. Are they opposite, alternate, compound leaflets, or whorled, very unusual? And the edge of the leaf will be either smooth, serrated, or lobed. Websites from universities, government entities, and commercial nurseries will pop up that have pictures and facts that can easily help you identify plants. If you forget what the terms mean, they will guide you on the sites. I created a spreadsheet and sorted the plants into those basic categories: trees, woody shrubs, perennials, bulbs. I documented bloom times and locations and identified well over 100 different species, not to mention different varieties of the broad categories. I can't even tell you how many different varieties of daffodils, azaleas, and hostas I have. But I was most fascinated by plants I had never seen growing in a home garden, like acanthus or clethra, and some I never even knew existed, like mountain laurel, Chinese paper bush, toad lily, fothergilla, Carolina allspice, hurricane lily. The descriptions of unusual plants often gave me details that I missed, like the wonderful fragrance of the Chinese paper bush or the balloon-like shape of the mountain laurel bloom. Every few days, something new was blooming. I found myself excited to wake up every morning and explore the garden. It was a combination of Christmas morning and an Easter egg hunt. This is definitely how Sherlock Holmes would have done it. He just would have done it better. To this day, there are still plants I've not been able to identify. The next mystery is more Da Vinci Code. Although the inciting death was not a murder, it was a mystery about a man who had a whole other life that most people never even suspected. At least I never suspected. The house had been cleared out when we took possession, but we found interesting things as we began to remodel, along with small pieces of broken porcelain knickknacks, lots of those. There were sequins in the carpet of the small bedroom that had been converted into a closet, and deep blue eyeshadow in the crevices of the bathroom cabinets. In the garden, I found plastic identification tags for plants that obviously had not survived. The most interesting one to me was from High Country Gardens in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Since I'd previously gardened in Colorado, I was familiar with them and knew they specialized in plants that grew at high altitude and did well in dry climates. Not exactly rainy, sea-level northern Virginia. As I worked in the garden, I was spending so much time outside that I quickly got to know all my neighbors, who were happy to talk about the neighborhood and their old neighbor, Carl. It took a while, but as I expressed an interest, people began to share their stories. Judy, the neighbor across the street, knew more about Carl than anyone else. He had been her best friend, and they ate together most evenings because he worried she wasn't eating enough. Carl had been in the Navy and then took a job at the U.S. Postal Service. He was born and raised in New Hampshire, where his father and other family members had been stonecutters. Judy bought her house in 1978, and Anne owned our little house at that time. Anne bought the house in the early 1960s and loved to garden. Many of the larger plants were from her tenure. Probably the oldest flowering shrub is the azalea in the middle of the front yard, and might have predated Anne. It even had a name, Big Red. As she got older, Anne needed help with the garden, so two men from her work, who both loved to garden, volunteered to help. Anne and the two men bonded over their shared passion for planting. Since Anne had no family she was close with, she left the house jointly to the two men when she passed away in the mid-1980s. One of the men was Carl, and he bought out the other man. And we then bought the house 30 years later from Carl's estate. When I joked about some of the amateur work in the house, the neighbor on one side told how Carl hired people who were down on their luck to do work around the house, even when they lacked the experience to do a professional job. That explained the crooked front porch and the strange tile job in the bathroom. And then another neighbor came over and asked if I would like to see the program from Carl's memorial service. That was such a strange offer, I had to say yes. You know how you feel when you see something you were not expecting and it leaves you confused as you process it? What I saw was a program that read something like Celebrating the Life of Mame Dennis and Carl Rizzi. There were two pictures. The one on the left side was an older woman with big hair, glamorous makeup, a colorful dress, and a nice smile. The one on the right was an older gentleman with thinning gray hair, a simple shirt, and a nice smile. Did two people die? I was missing something, and the neighbor was very quiet. I went home and immediately Googled Carl, something I'd never bothered to do in the year and a half we'd owned the house. I found multiple articles about Carl and even an NPR interview with him. Carl had a stage persona, Mame Dennis, that he'd performed since 1963, for over 50 years. He'd also built a community of budding performers where he and other seasoned performers mentored the up-and-coming artists and ran an organization called the Academy that annually recognized the accomplishments of the community. As president of the Academy, he shaped its policies and performances, insisting always on professionalism in performances and supportive relationships among the members. During the 1980s, Mame created HOOP, Helping Our Own People, to support members who fell ill with a new virus that suddenly appeared in the community. The HOOP Fund provided food, funds, and other support until the Academy closed shortly after Carl's death. Carl's personal motto was love, love, love. The lyrics to one of my favorite songs goes, "Who am I to judge another when I walk imperfectly? In the quiet heart is hidden sorrow that the eye can't see." As the years have passed and I've spent so many hours in the space Carl loved, I feel like I've gotten to know this man I never met. This man whose junk mail still occasionally lands in my house has become a real person with friends, interests, strengths, and weaknesses. I know he was a person who cared about others. Most people look the other way when someone who is just a neighbor is working too hard and not eating enough. They don't drag them over and make them a meal and good conversation. Most people ignore the financial struggles of others, at best giving them advice on how to solve their own problems. They don't hire them to do handyman work around their house. I know he was a brave man who would try things others rarely did. It doesn't take courage to have a garden full of the same plants everyone else grows, but Carl would give any plant a chance to grow. It doesn't take courage to watch a performance, but Carl went up on the stage for 50 years, doing something very bold. I know he was also an impulsive person. Most people who are serious gardeners research and select the optimal plant that will prosper in their gardens. But Carl would try any plant he thought would be interesting. The number of catalogs that showed up for years told me he was a shopper. I also know he was an artist at heart, creating a garden with plants that bloom 11 months out of the year. And he filled every space from the ground to the canopy of the ancient oak trees. He seems to me like a person who wanted to nurture the people he met and the garden around him. At the time we bought the house, my husband and I were finding our footing again after years of personal trials. We benefited from the healing power of a garden and bringing a home back to life. Nothing pleases me more than hearing that Carl would like what we've done. We garden in Zone 7B in Northern Virginia. One of the reasons I show what's growing in the garden is to encourage people to be brave and try new plants. I try to remember to be more like Carl, brave, nurturing and caring, and even a bit more impulsive. As always, the most creative solutions and the very best stories begin with the biggest challenges. See you next time.